In the garden, hours before the cross, Jesus spoke two words in Greek, ego eimi, I am, and a cohort of Roman soldiers, roughly 600 men carrying torches and iron, staggered backward and fell to the ground. John records it in chapter 18, verse 6, without embellishment. The men sent to arrest him could not stay on their feet when he simply identified himself. He could have said those words again from the cross. He did not. Instead, in Matthew 26, verse 53, while Peter was still holding a bloody sword over the severed ear of the high priest's servant, Jesus told him something most people read past too quickly. He could ask the Father right now, and more than 12 legions of angels would be dispatched. 12 legions, 72,000. A single angel in 2 Kings 19 had once emptied an Assyrian camp of 185,000 men in one night. He knew the math. He knew the option was real. And at the 9th hour, roughly 3 in the afternoon, nailed to a Roman beam on a hill outside Jerusalem called Golgotha, he did not summon them. He did not speak a command. He spoke a question. And he did not speak it to the soldiers gambling for his tunic at the foot of the cross. He spoke it upward, to the Father. 3 things are hidden inside that question, and they have been sitting in the original text for 2,000 years. The first is a psalm he was quoting, and the reason he quoted its opening line matters more than almost anyone has been told. The second is a single Aramaic word, preserved by both Matthew and Mark without translation. That does not mean what most English Bibles suggest it means. The third is a paradox that occupied the Church Fathers for 3 centuries, and none of them could fully resolve it, because it was never meant to resolve. For the people who want to stay with the text long enough to hear what it is actually saying, subscribe. This is the kind of work that lives here. The sky above the city had already gone dark. Matthew 27, verse 45 records it flatly, without metaphor. From the 6th hour until the 9th hour, darkness covered the whole land. 3 hours. The smell of blood and vinegar-soaked sponges hung in the air. The wood of the cross was rough against his back, splintered where his weight dragged downward every time his lungs demanded another breath. Below him, soldiers diced for cloth. Women he had known since Galilee stood at a distance and could not look away. And he, the one through whom, according to Colossians 1 verse 16, every throne and power and visible thing had been made, he hung there and did not end it. The legions stayed unsummoned. The earth stayed dark. And from somewhere inside that darkness, a voice that had calmed storms and raised a 12-year-old girl from her deathbed in Capernaum began to form the words of a song written 1,000 years before he was born. Before the song, there was silence. Long silence. Count the hours. Noon to 3 in the afternoon, a full Roman watch, the exact span a Passover lamb was being inspected inside the temple precincts less than half a mile from the hill. Luke 23 verse 34 preserves the first words spoken from the cross. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And then nothing. Not from Matthew, not from Mark, not from Luke. No groan recorded, no request, no further intercession. For 3 hours, the Gospels go dark along with the sky. 4 men who agreed on almost everything else agreed on this. Do not look inside those 3 hours. Do not try to fill them. The darkness itself is the record. Think about what that silence costs a writer. Mark was compressing. Luke was researching, interviewing, as he admits in his opening verses. John was remembering in old age. Each of them had every reason to put something into the gap. A word of comfort, a groan of pain, anything to hold the reader's hand across 3 hours of a crucifixion. None of them did. The ancient word Mark uses for the darkness, skotos, is the same word the Septuagint uses in Exodus 10 for the 9th plague on Egypt, the darkness that could be felt. A darkness with weight, a darkness thick enough to press against the skin. That is the word the earliest manuscripts of Mark 15 verse 33 put into the hands of a man who had been there. And then silence inside it. You know this kind of silence, not the silence of peace, the silence of the moment after the diagnosis when the doctor has left the room and you have not yet stood up. The silence of the prayer you have been bringing to God for so long that you have almost stopped expecting an answer, and you are still there, still kneeling, because what else is there to do? You have sat inside that kind of quiet. Jesus sat inside it for 3 hours. What was happening in those hours, the gospel writers refused to say, perhaps because they did not know. Perhaps because they knew it could not be put into human sentences without making it smaller than it was. The temple lambs were being examined for blemish. The sun had disappeared at the hour it should have been highest. Mary, his mother, stood somewhere near enough to hear him breathing and far enough that she could not touch him. The centurion, who would later declare, "Truly, this man was the Son of God," was still watching, still silent, still unconvinced. And the man on the middle cross, who had once stilled a storm on the Sea of Galilee with 3 words, "Peace, be still," let the storm inside his own chest rage for 180 minutes without opening his mouth. When he finally spoke, it would not be a command. It would be a line of poetry, and it would begin with a name, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is how Matthew 27 verse 46 preserves it. Mark 15 verse 34 gives a slightly different spelling, Eloi, Eloi. But both men did something unusual. They left the words untranslated. They wrote the Greek gospel around them and let the Aramaic sit there, raw, the way a mother remembers the exact sound her child made in pain. Then they translated underneath, for readers who would not know. My God, why have you forsaken me?" What most readers never register is that the dying man was not improvising. He was reciting. Those words are the opening line of Psalm 22 in modern English Bibles, Psalm 21 in the Greek Septuagint numbering used by the earliest Christians, a song written roughly 1,000 years before him by David, king of Israel. And it was not a random song. Read what it describes. A man mocked by everyone who passes. They wag their heads. They sneer. He trusted in the Lord. Let the Lord deliver him. His bones are out of joint. His strength is dried up like a potsherd. His tongue cleaves to his jaws. They pierce his hands and his feet. They divide his garments among them and cast lots for his clothing. Every one of those details was happening on Golgotha as he spoke. The soldiers at the foot of the cross had just finished gambling for his tunic. John 19. Verse 24 records it and points directly back to this psalm. The crowd wagging heads is in Matthew 27, verse 39. The specific insult about trusting God is in Matthew 27, verse 43. He was not crying out random words of despair. He was pointing to a text. And here is where the chapter turns. If you have ever opened the Bible looking for a verse that matched how you felt and then kept reading past it, you know what he was doing. Because Psalm 22 does not stay in the darkness. It starts there. It names it. It refuses to soften it. And then, somewhere around verse 22, it turns. The sufferer begins to declare the name of God to his brothers. The poor will eat and be satisfied. All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord. Posterity will serve him. A people yet unborn will be told that he has done it. That is how the song ends. With a generation that does not yet exist being told, he has done it. A Jewish man in the 1st century, trained on the Psalms from childhood, did not quote verse 1 without knowing verse 31. Rabbis taught the Psalms by first lines the way we teach hymns by title. Name the opening, and the whole song stands up inside the mind of anyone who has memorized it. So when the man on the cross opened his mouth and named the opening, every devout Jew close enough to hear was meant to finish the song silently. The ones who knew what he was doing heard something the crowd did not. They heard a man beginning a song whose last word is accomplished. But for that to matter, we have to deal with the word in the middle of his cry. The word Matthew and Mark refused to translate, sabachthani, because that is not a word that means simply absence, and it is not a word a man says carelessly, sabachthani. In the Hebrew of David's original, the verb was azavtani. Aramaic preserved the same root, azav, to leave, to abandon, to let go of. But the Hebrew Bible does not use this verb the way English uses leave. It does not mean stepping out of a room. It means breaking a bond that was supposed to hold. Deuteronomy 31 verse 16, God warns Moses that Israel will azav him, forsake him, and in the next breath says, and I will azav them. The word sits inside the covenant vocabulary. It is what a husband does when he walks away from a marriage. It is what a son does when he walks away from his father's house and does not come back. It is the language of ruptured relationship, not of distance. Listen to the prophets. Jeremiah 2 verse 13. My people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters. Isaiah 1 verse 4. A sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity, they have forsaken the Lord. In every case, azav is what the unfaithful do to the faithful. It names a betrayal. And now read it in the direction no prophet ever wrote it in. My God, why have you azavtani? The one who had never broken the covenant was using the word that belonged to those who had. The direction of the verb was inverted. The faithful son was asking the faithful father the question that only a covenant breaker should ever have had to ask. This is what most English translations quietly soften. Forsaken sounds archaic, solemn, something out of a hymnal. The Aramaic is not archaic. It is the sound of a door slammed from the inside. Pause here. There is someone sitting with this who has confessed something, named it, brought it into the light, heard the words of absolution spoken over it, and still cannot feel released. The memory comes back at odd hours. The shame surfaces in the middle of ordinary days. You have done everything you were told to do, and the weight is still there. Hold that for a moment against what the Aramaic is actually doing. The word he used is the word your silence has been using about you. He took the vocabulary of the unfaithful onto his own tongue. He spoke, in the language his mother had taught him, the exact word that belongs to the broken side of the covenant, while being the only one who had never broken it. Paul would later compress this into a single sentence in 2 Corinthians 5 verse 21. Him who knew no sin, he made to be sin on our behalf. The verse reads almost clinically until you hear azavtani underneath it, the sinless one speaking the sinner's word, not describing it, not observing it, speaking it from the inside. And the moment he speaks it, a second question opens behind the first one, a question that took the early church 3 centuries to stop flinching from. If the Son is eternally one with the Father, how can he possibly be forsaken by him? The question did not go away. It sat at the center of Christian thinking for 300 years, from the writings of Irenaeus in 2nd century Lyon through Athanasius in 4th century Alexandria and on into Augustine in 5th century North Africa. Each of them knew that if the Son is of one substance with the Father, homoousios, the word the bishops hammered out at Nicaea in 325, then the cry from the cross cannot mean what it sounds like on the surface. The Trinity cannot fracture. The Father cannot stop being the Father. The Son cannot stop being the Son. And yet the words are there. Matthew and Mark preserved them without softening. So the early teachers did something that looks strange to modern readers. They refused to resolve the paradox by erasing half of it. Athanasius wrote in his treatise against the Arians that what the Son suffered in his humanity was real, and what he possessed in his divinity was unchanged, both at once, neither canceling the other. Augustine, preaching on Psalm 21, made a move that still surprises people who read him carefully. He declared that the cry from the cross was spoken not only for Jesus himself, but in the voice of every member of his body across every century. the forsakenness of all those he had come to carry, gathered up into one throat and one breath, and offered upward. Cyril of Alexandria, writing a generation later, insisted that the Son experienced abandonment without being abandoned in essence, a distinction that sounds like word games until you realize he was fighting to hold two things no one wanted to let go of: the unity of God and the reality of what happened on the cross. None of them pretended it was simple. None of them claimed they had solved it. They called it mysterion, a word the Apostle Paul used in Ephesians 3 verse 9. Not a puzzle with an answer waiting to be found, but a truth larger than the shape of a human sentence. And here, the wood of the cross comes back into focus. The splinters against his shoulders, the iron through his wrists, the taste of vinegar on a cloth lifted by a reed. These are not theology. These are a Thursday afternoon in Jerusalem in the spring of the year 33, a body struggling for air, a man who had eaten bread the night before with 12 friends, now drowning slowly in his own chest. The fathers refused to lift the mystery up and away from that body. Whatever was happening between the Father and the Son, it was happening there, in that flesh, on that wood, under that darkness. Somewhere below the cross, a man who had never understood a sermon Jesus preached was about to hear him cry out in a language that sounded, to ears that were not listening carefully, like a name they already knew. And someone was about to run for a sponge. Eli, the first syllable of the cry. In Aramaic it meant "my God." In the ear of someone standing 20 paces away, half listening, sun gone strange, head full of rumor and fear, it sounded like the opening of a different name. Eliyahu, Elijah, the prophet who, according to 2 Kings 2 verse 11, never died, who had been carried up in a whirlwind 9 centuries earlier and was expected by every devout Jew of the first century to return before the day of the Lord. Malachi 4 verse 5 had promised it. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. So when the man on the middle cross opened his mouth and the first sound that came out was Eli, some in the crowd heard the wrong word. Matthew 27 verse 47 records it without commentary. This man is calling Elijah. They were not entirely wrong about the syllables. They were entirely wrong about the meaning. And then the small detail Matthew refuses to leave out. One of them ran, found a sponge, dipped it in cheap soured wine, the pasca that Roman soldiers drank in the field, sharp and vinegary, the smell of it carrying in the still air. He fixed the sponge to a reed and lifted it to a mouth that had not had water in 9 hours. And as he did, he said something that shows you exactly what kind of moment this was for him. Leave him alone. Let us see whether Elijah will come to save him. Not pity, spectacle. He was not bringing relief. He was buying time for the show. Every detail in that small action belongs to a man who has decided in advance that he is watching a curiosity, not a death. Look at what he was standing in front of. The sky black at noon. A man who had healed paralytics in Capernaum and raised Lazarus 4 days dead in Bethany, now suspended on Roman wood, quoting a 1,000-year-old psalm in his mother's tongue. And the only question this witness could form was whether a long-dead prophet might descend on cue and put on a better ending. There is someone listening who has been on the edge of the most important moment in someone else's life. A parent's last hours, a friend's collapse, a child telling you something you have prayed years to hear, and who realized afterward that you missed it. You were there. You heard the words. And something in you was already turned somewhere else, scoring it, waiting for a more recognizable sign. The crowd at Golgotha had every fact in front of them. Matthew, who recorded the misunderstanding, had every reason to soften it and did not. He left the mistake on the page because the mistake is part of the story. Mark 15 verse 36 preserves the same scene with the same vinegar and the same mocking pause. Two witnesses agreeing on the smallest, most embarrassing detail. The most important sentence ever spoken under that sky was heard by some as a request for a magic trick. And while they waited for fireworks that were not coming, the crowd kept shouting an older line back at him. "Come down from there. If you are who you say you are, come down." He had heard it for hours. He still had not answered. "Come down." Matthew 27 verse 40 preserves the full sentence, "If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." The chief priests, in verse 42, added their own version. "He saved others. He cannot save himself. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him." 3 times in 11 verses, the gospel writer records it. "Come down, come down, come down." It was the loudest demand on the hill, and he heard every syllable of it. Notice what the accusation actually was. Not that he was powerless. The priests themselves said he had saved others. They had seen him open blind eyes in Jerusalem, multiply bread for 5,000 on a hillside east of Bethsaida, walk across the Sea of Galilee at the 4th watch of the night. They were not denying his power. They were diagnosing its limit. He cannot save himself. That was the charge. And the charge was wrong in one specific word. It should have read, "He will not." The Greek of Matthew draws the line sharper than most English versions carry across. Udinatai, he is not able. That is what the priests said. But every line of the story before this moment says something else. In John 10 verse 18, weeks earlier, he had told a crowd in the temple, "No one takes my life from me. I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again." Exousia, authority. The word used for the legal right of a Roman magistrate, not strength, permission. And his permission came from himself. So the distinction matters more than almost any distinction in Scripture. Cannot and will not are not synonyms here. They are opposites. A God who cannot come down is a tragedy. A God who will not is an answer. Ask yourself what you would do with absolute power and a reason to use it. You have been quieter about this than you admit. There is a relationship you could end with one honest sentence. A person you could humiliate with a single forwarded message. An old wound you could avenge if you simply stopped holding it shut. You have held the match. You have not struck it. You know something about restraint that has nothing to do with weakness. Now multiply that by 12 legions of angels. That is what was happening on the middle cross in the 9th hour. The crowd was not waiting to see whether he had enough strength to descend. They were daring a power they could not measure to spend itself on something smaller than the reason it had come. And he refused, not by arguing, not by rebuking them, by hanging there. The silence itself was the sermon. The fact that he did not move was the theology. Every minute his feet stayed against the iron was a sentence preached against their definition of what a Messiah should do. They wanted a descent. He was offering a death. And somewhere inside that refusal, the cry to his Father was still ringing, Azavtani, the only word a man who had refused rescue had left. The hour was almost over. One word remained. One word remained, and John preserved it in chapter 19, verse 30. Tetelestai. It is finished. A single Greek word, perfect tense, an action completed whose results go on standing. Archaeologists have pulled tax receipts out of the sand of Egypt, stamped with the same word across the top. Paid in full. Debt closed. Nothing left owing. That is the word the man on the middle cross chose as his last. Hear what he was doing with it. At the beginning of this hour, he had opened his mouth and named the first line of David's song, the line about forsakenness. Psalm 22, verse 1, asking why. Psalm 22, verse 31 answers, "A people yet unborn will be told, he has done it." The Hebrew there is asa. The Greek Septuagint the early Christians read translated it with a form of the same verb John would use on Golgotha. Done. Accomplished. Finished. He had opened the song at verse 1, and now, in a single compressed word, closed it at verse 31. Everything hidden in the first cry was answered by the last. So every loop opened in this story now closes. I said at the beginning there was a psalm he was quoting. You have heard it, from the sneer of the crowd in verse 7 to the victory shout in verse 31, and you know now why he began with the opening line. I said there was a single Aramaic word most translations soften, azavtani, the covenant breaker's word, spoken by the only one who had never broken the covenant, so the broken side of the covenant could stop being ours alone. And I said there was a paradox the early teachers refused to flatten, how God could be forsaken by God. And you have heard Athanasius, Augustine, and Cyril refuse, each in their own century, to make that mystery smaller than it was. What happened to the people around the cross? The soldier who had mocked with the sponge went back to his garrison. The priests who had shouted, "Come down," walked home to prepare for Sabbath. The witness who had misheard Elijah in the syllable, Eli, returned to his life, carrying a story he did not understand. The centurion, according to Mark 15 verse 39, saw how Jesus breathed his last and declared what none of the others had dared. Truly, this man was the Son of God. One pagan officer counted among the committed few before the temple veil had finished tearing. And Mary, his mother, John 19 verse 27, records that John took her into his own household from that hour. She lived. She remembered every word. She is the reason we have the Aramaic preserved at all. The mother who heard her son speak the language she had taught him and never let the sound of it leave her. Here's what this means for you. There is someone listening who has prayed the same prayer for years and feels the silence has finally become a verdict. Someone who confessed the thing and was told it was washed away and still wakes up tasting it. Someone who is carrying a child or a parent or a marriage through a room they cannot see the walls of, and no one is coming to help. Someone who shows up on Sunday with the right words in their mouth and nothing behind them. Someone who is convinced this week that God is present for everyone in the room except them. Hear this. The distance you feel is not the distance he kept, it is the distance he crossed. When he cried Azavtani, he was not describing your experience from the outside. He was speaking it from the inside, in the covenant breaker's vocabulary, while being the only one who had never broken it. And then he closed the account. Tetelestai. Paid. Finished. The next time forsakenness rises in you at 3 a.m, you do not have to argue it away. You can let it name itself in the same word he named it in, and then sit inside the fact that the song did not end there. It ended with "He has done it." That is where you are sent, not to feel differently tomorrow. To know, the next time the silence presses in, that the silence has already been entered, answered, and closed from the inside. Let us pray. Father, we thank you that your Son did not come down. We thank you that when he opened his mouth in the 9th hour, he opened a song that ends in victory, and spoke from the side of the broken in the language of those who had broken, the only word there was left to say. We admit we have felt forsaken. We have said Azavtani in our own tongue without knowing it was already his. We ask you now for what only this cross can give, the knowledge that the distance has been carried and the strength to stand inside Tetelestai when our own hearts tell us nothing is finished. Hold us when we cannot finish the song ourselves. Amen. One last thing. I want to know which moment on this hill stayed with you. The 600 soldiers who could not stand when he simply said, "I am," the sponge lifted on a reed by a man waiting for a magic trick, or the single perfect tense word stamped across Roman tax receipts that became his last breath. Tell me below. I want to read what landed. And if this hour on Golgotha has opened something, wait until you see what happened when the women came back to the tomb at dawn on the first day of the week and found a folded cloth no grave robber would ever have taken the time to fold. That is where we go next.